Now, as we edge closer to entering 2022, we continue reflecting on the biggest political stories of 2021, and political analyst Ongama Mtimka is joining us now to speak to us mainly around the issue, of course, of the elections. You would remember that we had the 2021 local government elections. Ongama, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us here on Newsfeed, the PM edition. Let's start off then with, of course, it was the 2021 local government elections. A huge lesson that was learned, wasn't it, by the ANC in these elections?
Good evening to you, Tsecho, and your viewers. Thank you for having me. Absolutely, it's a huge, I think, consequence. I'm not sure about lesson. I know that it's a big consequence of all the failures of the party. The reason I'm reluctant to call it a lesson is that it doesn't seem to learn. Because if it learned at all, since 2009, the party would have been mindful of the fact that election results had been declining marginally since 2009, and it culminated into that huge loss in 2016. And as we see now with the 2021 local government elections, another local government has proved to pose seismic shifts for the ANC.
Now, this would prove then to have some kind of a political shift within the country.
Yes, absolutely. So ever since 1994, we've characterized our political system mainly as a dominant party system. You've got one-party system, you've got dominant party systems, you've got multi-party systems. What's interesting about South Africa is that the most evident trend, at least since it crystallized, since what had been happening since 2009 crystallized in 2016, has been that party dominance is going to be a thing of the past, and we seem to be moving towards multi-partyism, especially if you look at the popularity of parties that are also city-based. So this is going to add an interesting dynamic to our electoral system, especially also if you take into account that we have electoral reform. Whatever the developments get to be, one thing is certain, is that South Africa is engaged in a long-term process of transformation of its party system. Whether it's going to crystallize into multi-partyism is something that we're going to see a lot clearer by the 2029 election.
Now, what are some of the key drivers that we saw with these 2021 local government elections that will possibly go into 2022 and beyond?
Sure. So for the two biggest parties, the drivers have been implosion of those parties through failure to manage internal politics, which culminates into terrible performance in elections. Both the ANC and the DA in different ways have been affected by this. But also both these parties are facing contenders to their right and to their left. So the DA on its right is facing the Freedom Front Plus and also parties that are contesting its hold on minority representation, while the ANC, on the other hand, is facing a multiplicity of city-based parties, the EFF on its left, city-based parties mainly on its right, as well as its own implosion. As far as the smaller parties, I think a process that I've called dynamic fragmentation is going to continue, where we see that some smaller parties continue to disappear from the scene, while others, mainly new ones, are coming in, and we see some resilience also on the part of some newer parties.
Now, Ongama, talk to us about the possibility, or is there actually a link between the politics and the economics of COVID-19, especially when preparing and when running these local government elections?
Sure. So COVID-19 was quite another issue this year, in the sense that we began to see the challenges around holding the elections, given the changed environment in which political parties found themselves in. Two things about that. One, we saw a significant unwillingness by politicians to play by the same rules that had been imposed for over a year and some months on all other social institutions. And on the eve of elections, we saw the first introduction of a lot more relaxed level of lockdown, level 1, compared to what it had been previously. The other issue with respect to COVID-19 has been the change in what has been available to the President and the National Coronavirus Command Council in terms of what it can do to respond to waves of the pandemic or the severity of certain waves. So, for example, look at how careful government has been in the fourth wave to impose severe regulations, given the fact that they recognize that there's no longer much latitude from a social and economic point of view to play around with levels of lockdown in ways that are continuing to be optimal and not, in fact, result in havoc at the level of social and economic levels. So we've seen significant changes this year as far as the management of COVID-19. I do strongly feel that come next year, there's going to need to be a revision of the use or the reliance on the Disaster Management Act to manage the pandemic. I think that we, with 2 years of managing the pandemic, now we can go back to normal as far as processes of making the law and enforcing the law in South Africa. You cannot, I don't think it was the intention of neither the Disaster Management Act nor the State of Emergency Act to give a permanent leeway to the executive, to abrogate rights, for example, among other things. And in fact, the Constitution is very clear on what framework is there for the abrogation of certain rights and what process needs to take place between the National Assembly and the executive. What we have seen with COVID-19 is that the process, which is very much clear in the state of emergency section in the Constitution, or in fact even in the Act, as to how the National Assembly plays a role in making laws within the framework of an emergency, was actually not used in this instance. And I think that we need to go back to that, the spirit of what the State of Emergency Act, guides under such environments, even though the government tactically chose the more ambiguous Disaster Management Act and its related framework in order to manage the pandemic.
Ongama Mtimka, thank you so much for your time and all the best for 2022. Ongama speaking to us, the political analyst, around what we saw in the local government elections.